I'm really delighted to welcome everyone. And Nikhil, Shishir, Montek, your drawing power is such that we have a huge number of people from outside relative to our usual, and people seem to have braved the pollution to come, despite given what's happening outside, and of course we are hybrid. So let me give a warm welcome to everyone. We are very the topic of savings and investment in what is happening in the country is a really, to my mind, of the utmost importance for future growth. Because if you look at the record since independence, there's been a very close relationship between investment levels and growth rates all through. And since, in the case of India at least, the role of external savings has been very small, not more than 1 or 2% of GDP at any given time. So as the growth rates have been very connected with investment, so they have with the gross domestic savings. So both are very important in our case. And to give some idea, in the first 15 years of independence, after independence, the average savings rate was just 10-11% gross domestic savings. Average growth was just under 4%. So the period which everyone decries actually had an amazing growth rate, given the levels of domestic savings and investment. That is only 10-11% domestic savings and investment, and the growth rate just under 4%. And they'll skip to the 1990s till, basically 1990s, early 2000s. The savings had gone about 20% and corresponding investment rate, and growth was on 5.5%. Of course, during the golden years, when it coincides, by the way, with my period at the RBI, the growth rate has plummeted ever since I left the RBI in 2009. So in that period, savings had gone up to 33% average, all these averages, of course, and growth rate was around 8% plus on average. Then left the RBI, so things started going down. And so 2011 to now, growth rate around 6.5% with savings around 30%. There was all these averages with lots of ups and downs and so on. So the point I'm making, just as an introduction to this session, is that this really needs a lot of introspection and analysis, that if you have come down to around 30% savings rate and we aspire to have 8% plus growth, how can that happen given this kind of savings rate? Also, it's also consistent, by the way, with some other high growth countries. That is China, of course, 1980 to 2010, the savings rate went up from 33 to 50%, roughly speaking, over that 30-year period. And of course, the growth rate was around 10% a year. Korea, 1975 to 2000, the growth rate was around 8.6% average, and the savings rate about 35%. In their case, there was a much greater role for external savings, at least until the, I think, 80s or so. So my point is that, look, we are very consistent with other high growers, with other high grower periods. And as I said, what is distinct about us, of course, of China also actually, is that our investment mostly predominantly financed by domestic savings, with not that big a role for external savings. This is true, of course, of China as well. That's why the gross domestic savings rate is very important. But of course, it's not so simple, because you have, in the national accounts, you have three actors, basically: households, public sector, including government, of course, and corporate sector. And households have been traditional net savers, that is, excess of what they borrow. Public sector is a perennial net dissaver, which is true in most countries in the world. The corporate sector, particularly during the boom years, 2003 to 10, 11 or so, became net borrowers. And so now the borrowing is down. That is, their investment is roughly equal to their savings. That is basically internal accruals. So the question really is that why has the gross domestic savings come down, particularly of households, and of course of financial saving, that is net. You have to sort of distinguish also between the gross domestic savings of households and net, because if borrowing goes up, you still save the same amount, your net would be lower. So where will the resources come if the corporate investment picks up again, which has been low? And I think I only see one member of the corporate sector here, a friend here, Raju Kanoria. So at the end, I think you'll be put to task in explaining why you guys are not investing. So that brings me to now introduce our panelists. Nikhil Gupta is the Chief Economist at Motilal Oswal Financial Services, and is the author of a recent book, The 8% Solution. So he's providing a solution actually on how we can go up to 8%. So you better live up to that task, Nikhil. He has 16 years plus years of working experience in economics research. He's worked on India, China, US, Eurozone, UK, I guess not Africa or Latin America also. So you cover the rest of the world, but not Africa and Latin America. This book, by the way, was included in the Financial Times Best Books of 2023, chosen by none other than Martin Wolf, close friend of ours, Martin Wolf. So if he's chosen that as one of the best books of 2023, it must be right. He has worked in some other securities companies as well. He graduated from the Gokhale Institute for his master's, which is among the most well-known institutes of economics in the country, though in recent times well-known for some other reasons. He is a gold medalist. He also completed undergraduate's degree in BA in economics from Sri Ram College of Commerce, which I understand is more difficult to get into than Harvard for a BA. Shishir Gupta on the right is senior fellow at CSEP. He's been working on all kinds of issues. We're not able to get him to focus too much, but he's worked on economic growth, governance, institutions, urbanization, subnational reforms, and now savings and investment as well. Before joining us, he spent 14 years with the McKinsey Global Institute, where he led teams both in India and the US on policy research and client studies across many different domains. So he has written widely on these topics. And now, of course, at CSEP, outside you'll see a number of his papers. He has an MA and MPhil from Delhi School of Economics. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, of course, all you know. He was, of course, Deputy Chairman Planning Commission. His most important achievement in life has been to become Distinguished Fellow at CSEP. Of course, I'd read it on that there must be very few people who could have had as long a record of, I think, 30 years, from about mid-80s to 2014, of being at the absolute top of policy making in the country, 30 years. That's, I think, must be a record of consistency and as big a marathon runner in doing that. He was also the first director of the then newly created Independent Evaluation Office of the International Monetary Fund in 2001, and he came back then to head the Planning Commission. And he then has published his book on, in some sense, his own insider's account of policymaking from 1985 for these 30 years, called Backstage, the Story Behind India's High Growth Years. For those you don't know, he graduated from Delhi University and holds an MA from Delhi University and Students' College, and then MA and MPhil in economics from Oxford University. He's honorary fellow now of Magdalen College, Oxford. So before I end, question, what's common among these three as economic researchers? Anyone? No. But that is common, actually. You're right. One more thing. Exactly. None of them has a PhD, which demonstrates that those of us who've done PhDs wasted our time. So, Nikhil,
Thank you very much.
you can.
Thank you, sir.
You can.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Can I have the PPT up, please? Thank you, Dr. Mohan, for the introduction. So the topic we have today is India's savings and investment conundrum. What is the conundrum is what I think I'll explain in my presentation. I have been given 20 minutes and I intend to cover the next 17 to 18 slides that I have. I want to start with giving you an overview of India's investments. And as Dr. Mohan highlighted in his initial comments, there are three participants in any economy. There is a very, very well-defined government sector. When I say government sector, it includes the central government and state governments. Then there is a very well-defined corporate sector. And everything else comprises the household sector anywhere in the world. So all the individuals, all the unincorporated enterprises, all the mom and pop shops that we have across the country are a part of the household sector. These are the three domestic sectors in every economy. All these three sectors invest. So I'll not be explaining only or showing you total investments, but I'll be breaking up into each individual economic participant, what is their contribution to India's investments. I'll then do the same thing with gross domestic savings. What is India's gross domestic savings and what is the contribution of each of these participants? Most important, savings and investments in isolation present incomplete picture. Then we need to look at the difference between savings and investments, which is when you club it for all the three sectors, which is equal to the external deficit. If India's total investments are more than gross domestic savings, then it means the country is borrowing from outside. As Dr. Mohan mentioned, external savings or current account deficit. If my investments are lower than domestic savings, then I have excess funds and I'm exporting it to the rest of the world and I will be a current account surplus country. But what is more important is to understand what is the contribution of each of these three economic participants to current account deficit, right? And then lastly, I will explain a bit on household financial position. That is something, at the risk of losing modesty, I would say one area where I've spent a lot of focus on, not only in my regular job at Motilal Oswal, but in the book that I've released a year ago. So I'll start with domestic investments. Please spend a few seconds on this slide. It gives you the scatter plot. Red dot is India's total investments. Then we have total investments by each of the three participants. At the bottom, we have corporate sector. When I say corporate sector, it includes private and public companies. By public companies, I mean government-owned companies. So it includes the entire corporate sector, be it government or non-government. Then in the middle, the purple bar is the household share of in total investments. And then at the top, we have government. Again, here, government is not equal to the public sector across my entire slides deck. Government is center and states. CPSEs or all government-owned enterprises are a part of the corporate sector, right? There is only one slide, I guess, where I have changed that terminology, but I'll mention it otherwise. Generally, corporate sector in my analysis is private and government-owned enterprises, right? So what you see here is that in the mid-2000s, we had the peak of total investments. In fact, not only mid-2000, even after GFC, the great financial crisis, as Dr. Mohan says, not the global financial crisis, total investments ratio was at 39% of GDP, even in FY12 and FY13. From there on, however, we have seen almost a continuous decline in investment to GDP ratio from 39% peak to 34%, then 32%, and then it was stable at around 32-33%, roughly between FY16 to FY19. Then we had COVID, of course, that was an exceptional level of 28% that we had in FY21. But again, yes, sir.
Sorry to interrupt your train of thought, but in this so-called corporate sector, what would be the breakup? If you give
Of the
me
private and public?
Yeah, public sector.
That is, I guess, the next slide.
Oh, very good.
Right. Right. Yes. So now we are back to 32-33% of GDP total investments. Again, you will see that in some of the years, the sum of the components of these three components do not add up to total investments because we have something called valuables, which is not assigned to any of these participants, and there is something called errors and omission or statistical discrepancies also. It was slightly higher during FY17, FY18, but generally it has not been more than 5 to 7% of total investments, so less than 1% roughly. Then, as you asked, what is the division of public and private corporate sector within total corporate sector? So total corporate sector investments, again, when we had 39% of GDP as total investments in FY8, FY7, my corporate investments were in excess of 20% of GDP. Important point to note, roughly corporate sector accounts for half of total investments in India. This ratio is among the lowest. Most of the advanced economies and in many emerging markets as well, corporate sector accounts for as much as 65 to 70% of total investments. We know corporate sector is the most efficient sector because they invest in innovation, research and development, machinery and equipment. In India, household sector, as I showed you in the previous slide, accounts for as much as 35 to 40% of total investments, which is among the highest. The only other major economy that comes close to India in terms of the share of household to total investments is Canada, where the residential real estate or household investments also account for 35 to 40% of total investments. Right, coming back to, again, public sector, government-owned enterprises, if you look at FY11, FY12, when they had the peak, that was not the time of peak of total investments or total corporate investments. That was the time of peak for government-owned enterprises. But the main key highlight from this is just like total investments, corporate investments also peaked in FY7, FY8. They inched up to 20% again after GFC in FY10 and FY11. But from there on, 17%, 16%, and for a few years before COVID, it was stable at around 15% of GDP. Now, we have official, okay, one point, all the data that I show you, we have official data available up to FY23 only. FY24 official data is not available. So all the data that you see here for FY24, most of them are my estimates, right? So I believe that corporate investments in FY24 was again close to 14% of GDP, lower than what it was in the pre-COVID years. This chart, I think, is the most important when I talk about investments. We have heard a lot that government investments are doing most of the heavy lifting in India. And we know that central government investments have almost trebled in the last 4 years. Since if you look at FY20 in absolute terms, it was roughly about 3 trillion rupees. And in FY25, their budgeted amount is 11.1 total capital spending, including loans and advances. That is what you see at the bottom of this chart. The dark blue is the central government capex. Now, when we say capex, be it for the central government or state governments, there are two components. When you look at capital spending, there is actually capital expenditure done by them, and then there are loans and advances. So center gives a lot of loans and advances these days to the state governments. State governments use those loans and advances and spend them. So if I'm including center and state government's capex, I should deduct center's loans to state governments to avoid any double counting. So I should be, what I've taken here is center's government expenditure, capital expenditure, excluding loans and advances. That has also trebled in the last 4 years. So you can see from 1.5% of GDP in the pre-COVID years, in FY24, it was close to 2.6 and budgeted at 2.7% of GDP in FY25. If you look at the top, the yellow bar, that is for state government capex. Again, I've excluded loans and advances because most of the loans and advances given by states are to various corporate sector, which would be included, for example, electricity boards, etc., which would be included in the corporate capex as and when they spend it. It has been very stable in the past decade, or in fact 2 decades, roughly around 2.3, 2.4%. FY24, however, at 2.5% was among the highest in the last 15 years and much better than 2.2% a year ago. What is most interesting is the middle part in this, which are CPSE's capex. Now, when the budget documents are published, we know when the center tells us about total capital expenditure, but in the budget documents, they also publish what is the proposed investments to be done by the central public sector enterprises, right? What has happened in the past 4 years post-COVID is that the central government capex has gone up, but CPSE's capex has come down to the same extent. So if you actually look at the aggregate capex done by central government and CPSEs, it has been broadly stable over the last 10 to 15 years. And that is why if you look at the public sector capex, again, the blue scatter plot, red scatter plot, it has roughly been at 6.1% of GDP in the last 15 years or so, right? So public sector capex, including CPSEs, has been broadly stable pre-COVID and now. Corporate capex has been slightly lower, but I showed you that total investments are slightly higher. This is purely because of household capex. And when we say household capex, 2/3 of that is residential real estate. So we know that sector has been doing really well for the last 3 years now, probably 3.5 years now, since early 21. That continues to be the key driver of slight pickup in total investments that we have seen in the recent years. Then we do the same kind of analysis for gross domestic savings. Again, in FY7, FY8, when we had total investments at its peak, domestic savings were also at its peak, close to 38% of GDP. And as Dr. Mohan mentioned, India has never been too reliant on external savings to fund its domestic investments. Whenever that has happened, it has hurt us as an economy. Whenever my CAD has widened, be it in late 80s, early 90s, or 2012, 13, 14 period, as an emerging market, it hurts us. So we cannot be too much reliant on external savings. And that is why whenever, if I hope or if I predict a pickup in investments, I have to be very clear of what is the funding, what is funding that pickup in investments. Is it domestic savings? Because if it is not domestic savings, there is nothing else, but it means that it is being funded by external savings, or I'm expecting a pickup in CAD. Again, if you look at total domestic savings, government has almost always, except 1 year in again, this is not fiscal deficit. So government savings is not equal to fiscal deficit. There are different concepts, different definitions, but it has generally been in deficit. Corporate savings, again, just like total investments, we have seen a slight pickup in gross domestic savings in FY24, and it was almost entirely led by corporate savings. So corporate savings, official data is up to FY23, FY24 is our estimate. But even if I talk about FY23, corporate savings are at all-time high right now, right? At that time, when I showed you that corporate investments have lagged. So the reason why gross domestic savings have picked up is because corporate savings. And when I talk about corporate savings, again, it's a private corporate sector. Government-owned enterprises have been broadly stable at around 3% during the last 4 to 5 years. At the same time, household savings, which is one of my favorite topics, they continue to lag. Our estimates suggest that at FY24, they were still below 19% of GDP. And if you look at the history over the last 20-25 years, there have been only 2 years, FY16 and FY17 and FY23, when household savings have been below 19% of GDP. More interestingly, if you look at the composition of household savings, we have 2 parts: financial savings, which is actually available for the rest of the economy to borrow and invest, and physical savings. physical savings of the household sector are nothing but investments, which I showed you in the previous section. Financial savings, as you can see in this chart, in FY23, for which we have official data, was the lowest in almost 4 decades, 5.5% of GDP. It was around 7.5 to 8% in the pre-pandemic years. In the mid-2000s, it was in low double digits. But in FY23, financial savings were at net financial savings of household sector were at the lowest in 4 decades. Yes. Financial savings include everything: deposits, currency, your primary investment in stock market, insurance. Most of the gold is imported in India. Imports can never be a part of savings. Physical savings, 2/3 of physical savings are residential real estate. Households is individuals and unincorporated enterprises. As enterprises, they also invest just like a corporate sector. So 2/3 is residential real estate, the remaining 1/3 is broadly machinery and equipment. Right. So we move on to the third section. What about the balance? This is what combines savings and investments, right? Whether I'm saving more or investing more, how do I know? I come to know what is the difference of, or what is the net balance of each of the sector, whether they are a net borrower or a net saver. And I come to know of that when I look at their savings and investments. If a sector is investing more than they are saving, they are of course a net borrower. If a sector is saving more than investing, then of course it's a net surplus sector, a net lender to the society, to the economy. If you add up all of them, I have not put the scatter plot here, but that will be equivalent to current account deficit of India or for any economy, right? The breakup of the corporate sector. So why, one of the most important question, or the question that I have been asked the most is that, Nikhil, you keep saying household savings are low, India's domestic savings are lower. But if current account deficit is so comfortable, my current account deficit was less than 1% of GDP last year. In the last 2 to 3 years, it has been extremely comfortable, despite the fact that real GDP growth is 8%. So where is the concern of lower household savings or lower domestic savings leading to higher current account deficit? The reason why my current account deficit is so low, despite lower domestic savings or lower household savings, is because India's, first of all, total investment ratio is not rising significantly. You have seen in the first, I showed you in the first slide, India's total investment is still 32 to 33% of GDP, which is similar to what it was in the pre-pandemic period. And why my total investments are not picking up despite the government doing so much, despite the household sector picking up? Because the corporate sector is lagging. The best part is, while the corporate sector is not investing, their income or their savings are at all-time high. So if you look at the long-term trends of corporate net balance, their net borrowing or net lending, you will see that now corporate sector is a net surplus in India, right? In mid-2000s, when we had the best growth and my investment ratio was 38-39%, corporate sector was a net borrower to the tune of 7 to 8% of GDP. And again, like all other charts, the private corporate sector dominated this chart also. But now, and not only now, this is something which started happening even before the pandemic. So you can see right from FY18 to FY24, either their net borrowings were very low or they were a net surplus sector. In fact, FY22, 23, 24, post-pandemic, they have become a kind of net surplus sector. So my first big conclusion from this analysis is the corporate sector, the primary duty of which is to invest in an economy in terms to contribute to GDP growth, they have become a net surplus sector. They are the one who are generating income, but they are not able to match their spending to the income growth that they have seen. And that is why they have become a surplus sector. This question has been on the mind of why is it? Shishir will explain a part of that, why the corporate investments have not picked up and what is it that is needed. So I'll not spend time on this. Just like corporate sector has become a net surplus sector, the household sector surplus has, as I mentioned, net financial savings of household sector is equal to its net surplus. It was the lowest in 4 decades in FY23, and we see it broadly stable level in FY24. Just like corporate sector has a very high income growth, but their spending growth is not in tune with the income growth, which has made them a surplus sector. The situation is the reverse for the household sector. Their income growth is not very high, but they are the one who are spending in the country. And that is why if anybody is growing their consumption or spending in excess of their income growth, either their borrowings or they are saving less, both of which is happening on an aggregate basis for the household sector in India as well. How much time do I have, sir?
2 minutes, okay.
Okay. So now, financial position of the household sectors. So I'm a part of the stock market Motilal Oswal group. We get a lot of data on listed companies, and many a times we believe that financial position of the listed companies represent the financial position of the corporate sector, which is not true. The unlisted corporate sector is huge in India. It's huge, be it in terms of employment, in terms of profit generation, in terms of taxes paid, in terms of capital employed or investments. The share of unlisted corporate sector is 2 to 3x of the listed corporate sector, right? Government sector is a very, very well-researched sector. We get a lot of data on monthly basis now for states as well. And on annual basis, we have a long historical data on the government sector. But household financial position is something where I believe a lot of work can be done. There are gaps, but we need to cover whatever is already available. And that is what I intend to do in the next 2 minutes, last 2 minutes for me. This slide gives you a broad idea of household financial position in India. It covers 5 indicators. Income, what is the growth? So what each column represent here is the decadal average growth in each of these indicators. The first column, light purple, gives you the average decadal growth in household income from 1980s to FY24 based on decades. Last column gives you the 4 years of 2020's decade. Then you see consumption. What is the growth in personal consumption expenditure every decade? Then the third column is for investments, which is physical savings, right? Household physical savings or household investments. The fourth column is net financial savings. And the last column is for household borrowings. Please note, this is for household borrowings, not for debt, because every other indicator is also annual data. I could have included debt, but that would have become an outstanding or a balance sheet item. Everything is a P&L item, right? Income, consumption, investments. Consumption and investments together is total spending. Then we have net financial savings, which is pure savings of the household sector. And then we have borrowings. 2 or 3 key highlights. First, decade after decade, household income growth has decelerated from 15% in 80s, 90s to 12% and to 10% in the last 4 years. For the first time in the post-independence history, consumption growth outpaced income growth in the 2010s decade. So even before the pandemic, consumption growth outpaced income growth, right? So in 2010s decade, when my income growth was 12%, consumption growth was 13%. And even in the last 4 years, which include the impact of COVID, FY21, when everything collapsed, and FY22 and 23, when there was a base effect, consumption growth outpaced income growth.
So household income growth.
So CSO publishes data on annual basis for personal disposable income.
Directly comparable with the other. Personal disposable income in the national accounts. Personal disposable income in the national accounts.
Which is roughly 98% of GDP, right?
No, now 78% of GDP.
78.
Yeah, because corporate and governments also on income.
Wow.
Right. Then we have the final conclusion from this slide is the gap between financial savings and borrowings. So you can see, just like income growth has been decelerating, the growth in financial savings has also been decelerating. 20% to 15% to 8% to 5% in the last 4 years. Now, this is growth. What eventually matters is net financial savings as percentage of either household income or percentage of GDP, which was going up right until FY10, FY11, FY12, something like that. When we had financial savings, even though financial savings growth has been coming off, it was higher than income growth, as you can see in all these charts. It was again only in the 2010s decade, when consumption growth outpaced income growth, that my net financial savings started falling as percent of GDP and in terms of CAGR growth as well, which continued in the post-pandemic period. And lastly, the borrowing part. Again, it's not like households were not borrowing in 2000s or 1990s. Their growth, as you can see, was even in excess of 20% in 90s and 2000s. But what eventually matters is this gap between savings and borrowings, right? The more you, and of course, the composition of borrowings. Since I'm running out of time, I'll just show you this one last slide on household debt, because this, I think, is, we all know, most important part within household financial position right now. Most of this is not official data, in the sense it is not presented as such. All of this data is either from the RBI or from NHB, National Housing Bank, or from some financial regulator, but I've just compiled all that data. None of these data is my data. I've just compiled data from different sources to present these to you. What this tells you is that the top right-hand side chart, household debt now is close to 50% of GDP, which was about 30% a decade ago, right? Now, even though it is 50% of income, sorry, this is 50% of income, even though it is 50% of income, it is one of the lowest among the major countries in the world, right? We have, even in China, we have household debt to income more than 100% of income. In the US, most of the Western world, we have more than 100%. There are countries like Australia and Nordic countries where it is more than 200% of their income, right? So it is among the lowest. But the question is it threatening or not? How do I know what level of household debt to income is crossing a threshold, near the threshold, or something? It is dependent on the nuances of the country. The only ratio, according to me, which tells you what level of household debt to income ratio is the threshold level, or the level where I should be concerned or not, it can be told by looking at the debt service ratio of the household sector. Till the time a borrower is able to repay its obligation, it is okay. But when I see that a larger and larger portion of my income is used to service the debt, it means first, I will be able to use the rest of my income to spend less, because now I have a smaller portion to spend and save. And the larger the share of my income I'm using to service my debt, the more dangerous it becomes for me. Because if tomorrow there is something uncertain that happens, it will become big, right? So if you look at the bottom charts, the bottom left-hand side chart, it gives you the composition of household debt. There are only 4 parts in household debt. The most safe, secure, and the desirable portion of household debt is mortgage debt, because it is secured, it is a long tenure and low interest rate borrowing. So this is the safest sort of borrowing. Then there is agricultural debt, which is kind of regulatory. Banks have to lend to the agricultural sector. And as you can see in the bottom left-hand chart, almost about 15% of total household sector is agricultural debt. Then there is business debt, because I explained that household sector includes all the unincorporated enterprises. So there is business debt, which is primarily working capital loans, which accounts for around 23-24% of total household debt. But if you look at the purple, dark purple column in that, that is non-mortgage personal loans, which according to national accounts should be the primarily consumption-based loans. If you look at this composition, it is only the non-housing personal loans which is witnessing an increase in its share from 26% to 31-32% the last 5 years. Right now, within this, I've given you some details, but broadly, it's a consumption-based loans which are growing at the time when consumption growth is slowing. Right? And last chart, I told you what is the threshold level of household debt to income ratio. The bottom left-hand chart gives you our estimate. This is not official again. DSR is calculated using some BIS methodology wherein we need effective interest rate or effective maturity of loans and debt to income ratio. My estimate suggests that debt to service ratio for India's household sector has increased to 12% now, which was 9 to 10% prior to COVID, which simply means that as much as 12% of my annual income is used to service the debt, right? And just to give you an idea of how India sits with other major countries, the bottom right-hand side chart, it looks at various major countries and it compares these countries as debt to income ratio and DSR. Normally, you would believe the higher the debt to income ratio, the higher the DSR. That's not the case. India has the lowest debt to income ratio, as I explained you, but its DSR of 12% is among the highest. Why? Because my interest rates are much higher and the maturity of my loans is much lower. Why is the maturity lower? Because most of my loans are consumption-based loans. I just showed you in the previous chart, mortgage loans is only about 30% of total loans, right? The remaining 70% are short-term loans, either crop loans or working capital loans or consumption-based loans. So the effective maturity of India's household debt, according to my estimates, is only about 6 years, which is as much as 15 to 18 years in most of the developed world, including China, where according to PBC, it's 18 years. And the interest rate is again the opposite. My effective interest rate is 10%, while it is 2 to 3% in most of the other countries. So if I do the back calculation, my calculation suggests DSR will reach 15%, which has been kind of seen as a threshold by the BIS for household DSR. India's DSR, which is close to 12% now, will reach 15% if my debt to income ratio is household debt to income ratio is close to 65% of income. We are already above 50%. If we continue to do what we have done in the past decade, by which I mean income growth and debt growth are the same as it has been in the last 5 years or last 10 years, household debt to income ratio will be 65% by the end of this decade. That is, we have only 5 to 6 years in terms of reaching that threshold. I don't want us to be on that level. And that is why I am personally very happy when the RBI came out with all the targeted steps that they have come out to restrict unsecured lending growth. I hope it leads to this kind of, but because of shortage of time, I'll end it here. I hope it gave you some idea of what is a conundrum. Sorry. So the conundrum is we are hoping for a pickup in investments, especially corporate investments. But we need to be very clear that if corporate investments pick up, we have to be very clear of what is funding those investments. At this point in time, my household savings are much lower when my consumption is weak. Ideally, corporate investments pick up when consumption is also picking up, which means there is limited scope for household savings to pick up if consumption picks up. So if corporate investments pick up, which leads to a pickup in total investments, it is very likely that my current account deficit will widen, which is a situation which I don't want our economy to be. So that is a conundrum, whether we actually want or we want to see a pickup in total investments led by corporate sector. I end it here. And Shishir, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nikhil.
Thank you, sir.
For that very enlightening presentation. Shishir?
Yeah.
Yes, please. I should also recognize that Secretary Economic Affairs, Ajay Seth, is here. So I hope you'll tell us at the end on what we are planning to do to solve this conundrum.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mohan. Thanks everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to be sharing our work that I did with Rishita last year on this issue. At the outset, let me start by saying that I think the conundrum is there, but I don't expect, Nikhil, that if corporate investments pick up, it will necessarily lead to a higher current account deficit. And we'll just go through it. Okay. I'll take around 7-8 minutes because I think Dr. Mohan talked about different growth phases Indian economy has seen. So this chart is annual growth of real GDP from 95 till 2024. And apart from the surge years from, let's say, 2003 to 2011, the growth rate has fluctuated between 6 to 6.5%. But those boom years, it was around 7 and 8% of it. This is the expenditure side breakup of GDP, which essentially is into investment, private final consumption expenditure, trade, exports, imports, and government final consumption expenditure. Nikhil talked about it, right? And Dr. Mohan also talked about it, that when we were going fast, investments picked up. It's coming out from this chart as well. And what Nikhil said is absolutely right. You can see on the right-hand side top panel that since 2012, the share of consumption, private final consumption in GDP, strangely has started moving up, which he talked about, right? So eloquently. This is the breakup of investment into three sectors Nikhil also talked about. So I'll be brief here, right? Essentially, the important thing is to notice the red portion of the bars, which is private corporate sector. And what you can see is that when India started growing very fast, the surge years from 2004 to 2008, it was the increase in investment. The top rectangular numbers are overall investment. They increased by 10 percentage point, 29 to 39, led primarily by increase in the corporate sector investment, 8% to 20%. Now, interestingly, overall investment has remained constant from 8 to 12 at around 40%. But there was a flip of roles here between the corporate sector and the households, which are at the top. The corporate sector investment came down from 20 to 14, picked up by increase in household sector. And I would be very keen, Nikhil, to understand why that might have happened. Over time, investments have settled at around 32%, with moderate investment numbers for the corporate sector. The key thing is, as Nikhil also said, when we were growing fast, corporate investment surged, and now they are at a moderate level, right? In the next few slides, I'll try and explain why, to our mind, corporate sector is not picking up. So, corporate sector investment to GDP can be broken down into two parts, right? What is how much corporates are investing as a proportion of their sales, and how big is the corporate sector in GDP, right? I mean, so when we look at this left-hand side, we need to realize it's made up of these two MECE components. The leftmost panel is corporate investment to GDP, the variable of interest, right? And the two right panels are the two components. First one is corporate investment to sales, how much corporates invest as a percentage of their sales, and what is the share of sales in GDP, which is the rightmost panel, which you can see increased quite significantly from early 2000s to 2014, which basically means corporate sector was becoming a bigger share of GDP, then declined, and then over time has stabilized. And my assessment is that it might go up now in the future. But the key point is that in corporate investment to GDP is mostly driven by how much corporates invest as a percentage of their sales. This probably is the most important slide. So the right panel shows corporate investment to sales that we just saw. And ultimately the question is, what drives corporates to invest? Right? We feel that it is a function of two things. How much profits corporates are making, which is the first. So this is a regression, right? So corporate profitability, which is the first row, profit over corporate sales, right? So it's a function of two things, profitability and what is the growth outlook corporates have for the next period. So essentially, corporates are enthused to invest more if their profitability is higher and also they feel growth outlook is better, right? And this is the estimated versus actual. And you can see, and that barring few years, it's a decent fit, right? We did it from the year 2000 to 2020. So if we believe that corporates decide to invest depending on their profitability and the growth outlook, then what is the picture of these two elements? The left panel is the profitability, and this is what gets talked about the most, right? As you can see, profitability was at its peak at around 9% in 2008. Interestingly, it has been coming down significantly, steadily since then. But the last few years, it has gone back. So this is what everyone talks about, right? That if profitability is back, why are corporate investments not back? To our mind, the answer is on the right panel. Look at the growth projection corporates had about India's GDP in the surge growth years, right? I mean, around 8%. And what is it now? Around 6.5%. So while one element is back,
What's
profitability.
the basis of that corporate estimate of projected growth?
So we looked at IMF's growth projection for the next year when we ran the regression. So we said, okay, corporates investment is a function of their own profitability and GDP growth outlook, which
As projected in
by
the
IMF.
IMF thing. Okay.
Yeah. So the next question is, okay, why is growth outlook tepid compared to 8% we had in the surge years? One of the key elements to our mind is the relatively moderate growth of exports. The left panel is export growth in CAGR terms for these years from 94 to 2004, and the periods are mentioned. And the right panel is the growth rate of real GDP. And one can see that when exports were rising or growing fast, GDP was growing fast. And over time, export growth has really come down, right? So between 8 to 12, it was 10.8 compared to 20% in the surge years. And between 2012 to 20, it was 3.5. In the last couple of years, there is a resurgence sort of picture on the export side at 7.9% in the last 2 years. And that you can see in the recorded growth rates in GDP also. But this is still slower. The important thing is exports are still growing slower at 7.9 or 8% compared to what we had of around 20% growth earlier. Last point on this is, though we are at 8%, growing at 8%, this we are growing despite global economy growing at a significantly slower pace. So while we are doing better relative to the global economy, if we want to grow faster than 6.5%, our exports need to grow much faster. And that is a challenge given the outlook on global trade. What drives exports? And this is where I end. On the left panel, one of the main vehicles of exports are large firms, right? So in India, roughly 50 to 55% of all exports are done by large firms. Our definition of large firms is all firms that have annual reports submitted to Ministry of Corporate Affairs, the data that we get from CMIA. And when we looked at OECD, their definition of large firms in anyone who has more than 250 employees, the OECD average is around 40-45%. So in terms of share of large firms to overall exports, we are there. So in terms of vehicle, we are there. But if you look at the right-hand side, large firms' revenues, only 15% of them, which is the lower red portion for India, only 15% of large firm revenues come from exports, compared to 25-30% for countries like South Korea. So this basically the way we interpret it, right? I mean, the reason why it is lower, large firm revenue from exports is half in terms of share compared to Korea, countries like Korea. It has got to do with their productivity, right? Or their competitiveness. So bottom line, if we want to grow, the reason why why corporates are not investing. How do I go back? The reason why corporates are not investing is because of growth outlook. Sorry, I mean, I want to go back. How do I go back? I'll just
press the below button, not the whole.
Okay, okay. Just, yeah, one more. Yeah, sorry. So the reason why corporates are not investing is because of weak growth outlook. And weak growth outlook, one of the key reasons is weak export growth. And for that, I think our corporates need to push on productivity and competitiveness. So to answer you, if we grow, I mean, corporates will start investing, to my mind, when there is better growth outlook, which of all other elements should include us being more competitive. And if that happens, I think household savings will also pick up, because they are dependent quite significantly on GDP growth. But I actually want to learn and hear what you guys think. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Montek?
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
now resolve the issues.
well, this desperate desire to resolve issues I don't approve of. Let us enjoy the issues. Let us rotate them three-dimensionally to see their nature. No, first, let me compliment both the, I was going to say paper writers, but I should say PPT preparers, since we haven't seen the paper. But I do think there is some very interesting questions. Bottom line is that they both appear to be subscribing to the view that our growth prospects are less wonderful than, let us say, one often hears in newspapers, in official announcements, and so on. And I think there has been a tendency very recently, for example, to keep referring to the last year's growth rate at 8.2%. Now, I mean, I don't want to go into everybody's done the growth stuff. There's bound to be a recovery from a pretty bad depression. So you really have to ask yourself, what's the economy's more average growth over the period? And I mean, it's like one of those things, in the last 3 years, the average, I think, is 8%. But in the last 6 years, the average goes down to about 5% or 5+. So it depends on what you regard as the underlying growth. I mean, in a polarized situation, one can imagine, particularly just before an election, I mean, there will be people emphasizing one approach or the other. But there's no question that somewhere we should be thinking, what are the corporates investing for? I mean, this animal spirits assumption. There is an assumption that many people share, that corporates are just animals. They want to invest. That's not necessarily true. And I think what, in a way, both of them are sort of saying is that investment will happen as and when corporates feel that there's growth coming around the corner. Okay. Now, I should mention one point here, which I think of different people. I mean, Sujit is present here, so maybe I give him an opportunity at this point to make his point. He would question the assumption that investment rate has fallen, because the investment rate here is in current prices. Then, I mean, and there Sujit is right. If you look at what they call constant prices, then there isn't apparently a big decline. Sujit, do you want to sort of stand up and say that in 2 minutes? Yeah.
Because otherwise, then you won't have to get up and do it again, if you can. What? No, but then we can continue the discussion. Let him say his bit.
The simple point is that the deflator that you have as investment to GDP, the GDP deflator is growing at a much faster rate than the investment deflator. And that's it. So at least.
Yeah, okay, well, you made, it's an important.
And
Yeah. Start on
I had.
yeah, I think if you can have that.
You want to put that out?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm a great believer in let's separate get the facts out. So if there's a factual difference, let's get. While you're putting that up, you might want to continue.
This is the one.
There it is. Yeah.
So the gray line is the constant price line of investment, which is basically at 35% for 22-23.
Okay. And the red line is the current price. So basically what you're saying is, and this is interesting, that even in the constant prices, there is a decline, certainly compared to the peak years, but maybe the decline is greater
if you just look at the red line. That's fair enough. Now,
One
I
thing-
mean,
One second.
oh,
Just let me finish. Rakesh interrupted. The, what you've got over here,
the chair can never interrupt.
no, seriously, otherwise we'll go on forever.
Yeah, I-
What you've got over here is both the deflator for the numerator and the denominator is the GDP deflator.
Mhm.
My point is, and that's an important point, the deflator for the numerator should be the investment deflator. The deflator for the denominator should be the GDP deflator. That's all.
That's what he should have done, no?
No, so
Yeah.
I don't know, I mean, I took,
Now, is that clear? I mean,
Yeah, that's clear.
No, if you use
That is
the
true.
same deflator,
No,
there'll be no difference in the,
no.
yeah.
So what you need to do is when you do investment to GDP, the investment should be deflated by the
Investment
investment deflator, and the GDP should be deflated by the GDP deflator.
No, that's what I thought, but what I mean is, I don't then understand the red line. Because the red line can't be,
so this is straight from national accounts, right? I mean, if they
what
break,
is got, the non-red line, the red line is the nominal to the nominal.
Correct.
Investment to
Correct.
GDP.
correct,
Has no deflator either way.
yeah,
Then the red line has the deflator, the same deflator to both of them.
no, but then it should be the same line.
Yeah.
If it's the
No,
same
no,
deflator.
but the gray line, the real investment comes from national accounts, so they must have deflated it by the relevant deflator. And the GDP by, I'm assuming the.
No,
deflator-
sir, he is right. Real investments are deflated not by GDP deflator. There is a separate investment deflator. which-
Exactly.
And you are right.
So that's what he's done.
That's what is done here.
Yeah.
It's not the same deflator that
Sure.
they are.
Basically, now,
39% in 2004 to 2011. That's what.
These numbers are straight from national accounts, so we can.
Okay. All right.
anyway, I think both narratives ultimately focus on what's going to happen to investment. And I think that's the right approach. Shishir's narrative,
So just one interruption. What could be useful to do is to do that for corporate investment. Same thing, okay? So that's where the big change is. Sorry.
okay, no, that's fine. Shishir makes the additional point that corporates are really worried about exports, not just about growth prospects. And there that's an important issue because there are two dimensions where, our performance of the last several years is poor. And that is, one is GDP growth has been lower than in the past. You could argue that COVID and all kinds of things that didn't happen earlier would have depressed things. That's fair enough. You could also say that it's been lower because of simply the running out of steam, and that's more serious. But he says that it's also because we run out of steam in exports. Now, exports have nothing to do with these domestic savings rate, etc. That seems
That's right.
he's treating it kind of, and I think there's logic there. He's treating it as a sort of substitute for some inherent underlying productivity or efficiency or competitiveness and so on. And there really our performance is pretty poor. That's an area where as a ratio of GDP, as a ratio of world exports, we've gone down. And the growth rates are much below the targets that have been specified. Both for this period and of course the phenomenal increase as expected. Now, the point is that if corporates looking at that feel that, look, there's something wrong and they're not going to invest, that's not a good sign. I think the other point which is brought out in Nikhil's paper, it's to my mind quite important, what's happening to the net saving, the saving structure of the economy. Now he's bringing in, the fact that, the contribution of household net savings to total available resources going down. That's been mentioned by many people and he's documented very nicely. One thing that I've always been puzzled, and maybe you can think about that, because they say that net savings means we put in the investments that guys make in the capital market. is that only in new issues or is that also secondary investment? Somebody goes and buys something in the market. Now, if you're buying something, and this is something I'm confused about, and I would like gyan, as it were, from you. If you're going through a period where there's a ramping up of capital market values, it may or may not be real, but it's there. Then what's happening is when I pull out my lousy savings and buy some shares at an inflated price, thinking that they're going to rise even more, then basically somebody is making a lot of capital gains, okay? I don't think that capital gains is reflected anywhere in income. So this whole treatment that I'm using my savings in order to make a financial investment, that fellow is making capital gains. That capital gain doesn't figure in any national account investment calculation, at least that I'm aware of. And maybe I'm not properly informed. And I just want to I want you to think about, not necessarily now, does that create a problem? And obviously it doesn't create a problem if you've got if capital values are rising at roughly the same rate as inflation. But that's not been the case. Capital values are going up much more. And how does that alter our thinking? Because if that guy has actually got a lot of savings, an income that isn't reported, and his consumption is, of course, reported, then he's actually saving more. So that whole calculation of net savings doesn't seem to me to have everything put together. I think the other issue that is important, which Nikhil's paper brings out, is the tremendous rise in household borrowing and household debt. And this has been talked about in the papers and so on. My instinct is that it's a problem, but I don't think it's at the moment a serious problem. It would become a problem not just for the national balance, but primarily for the banks. I mean, you said that if I have to make a lot of payments, I'm in trouble. But actually, the banks are also in trouble.
Yes.
So there's some assumption that these things will be sorted out. But I think the problem is less than what I would call systemic. And fortunately, the RBI has been sending out all the relevant noises. And although I see from the newspapers that the government is making contrary noises, that you shouldn't be increasing provisions, etc. I mean, to my mind, increasing provisions when banks are going into somewhat more risky activity is a good idea. So I think that's a problem, but I don't think it's a big problem. However, the bottom line is that we are not on an 8% growth path. What Shishir has done is he has taken the IMF's assessment that we are on a 6+% growth path. I think that's probably not unreasonable. But if we are on a 6+% growth path, and we are projecting our investment capabilities as if we are on the 8% growth path, we have a serious problem, because what will happen is that no productive enterprise will invest on that basis. But as long as there is a thinking even in the press and commentators that ठीक है भाई, प्राइवेट सेक्टर इन्वेस्ट नहीं कर रही जितना करना था, तो क्या फर्क पड़ता, सरकार इन्वेस्ट कर दे. Now note, the really important thing which he's brought out is that this investment that is being done is government investment. It's not the public sector. And the public sector are, at least, I mean, they may or may not be as efficient as they should be. They certainly are not. But at least they have guys who do this sort of thinking and planning. And it is, to my mind, quite extraordinary that we've got a shrinking down of public sector investment. I don't know if I read your numbers correct, but I think that's what your numbers say.
Yes.
That the public sector, in the sense of the incorporated public sector, investment is shrink.
Yes.
This essentially means that the ministries that are doing the increased investment have a better assessment of what are the investments that are really productive than the public sector, which is actually full of guys who are exposed to whatever the commercial conditions are. So you've got the private sector is not investing, you've got the public sector is not investing, but the slack is being taken up by the government. Now, this is welcome back to the world of the 1970s, no? And Sujit disagrees with that. So I think this is the time for you, Sujit. I'll stop because I don't want to go on and on. Why do you think that's not so?
Let me some order. I think we'll come back, Sujit, because it will be better to, because this is a general issue.
Well,
not a-
you're the chairman,
yeah,
so
not
I
a
leave it.
specific one for the, as you.
No, that's
earlier.
it. I mean, I'm
No,
just.
but definitely, yeah. So, first, Nikhil, do you want to respond to anything as of now?
Yes, sir. Sir, you asked two questions on household savings. First, whether when we look at capital market exposure within household financial savings, do we take only primary issuances or we take secondary market transactions as well? So we take only primary issuances because the assumption is most of the secondary market transactions happen within the household. One is a seller, the other is a buyer. It's happening within the household sector, and that's why it cancels out when we look at the aggregate household sector. Now, this is something which has been happening from 1950s, from when we have data.
And is it the same as a land transaction?
Land transactions data we don't get, so physical.
No, but I'm saying in the national accounts, my understanding has always been that that's regarded as transfer payment, so it's not counted.
Yes.
But same issue that you're saying for the stocks. That's my point, actually.
That's fair enough. I mean, I see the point, actually.
But
That's
more
okay.
importantly, SEBI has published a paper in September 24, wherein they actually provided their own estimate of household financial savings from the capital markets. And what they did, they said, okay, it is possible that when the household sector is selling, the other party is also within the household sector, but a household sector can also sell it to the foreigner, right? How do we take care of that? Because we have no clue of how much share that is being sold by the household sector to the foreigner. That then we need to include a part of secondary market transactions also into the financial savings then. So what SEBI did, and this is a very rigorous exercise that they did, they used PAN level data of all the transactions that happened in the last 4 years. FY21, FY22, FY23, and FY24 as well. They included all the transactions that happened within household and non-household sector, right? Be it buy or sell, to come out with a better measure of household financial savings through capital markets. And the conclusion was, it was only in FY21 when their estimate was slightly higher than the national account estimates that was published by CSO or RBI. For FY22 and FY23, for which we now have SEBI data as well as RBI data, they are almost the same. For FY24, RBI has not published, SEBI has published, and it also comes out broadly the same because we use RBI's methodology to come out with our estimate. So the bottom line is that the thumb rule or the principle on which this number is estimated in CSO or by the RBI, they use only primary issuances because they believe most of the buy and sell in the secondary markets happen within the household sector. So on net basis, they cancel out. But when the SEBI also included those secondary market transactions which happen within the household and some other sector, the numbers did not change meaningfully. If I remember correctly, the average difference in the FY21 to 23, 3 years data for which we have both the data, it was only about 0.2 percentage points of GDP. That is point one. On second thing you asked, so if secondary market transactions are not included, but since a lot of transactions happen, it's a balance sheet item, it does not get captured anywhere in GDP. Right? So is it possible that we are probably underestimating some things because people make profits, but since it's a balance sheet item? So in a way, and correct me if I'm wrong, you are referring to the possible wealth effect.
Well, the wealth effect is certainly there, and that gets reflected in
That
consumption.
will get
Consumption.
right. In fact, we recently published and we did more work on wealth effect as well. So we included what is the household share in equity market, what is the outstanding stock of deposits, EPFO, insurance, everything. And we found out that yes, household net financial assets have increased tremendously in the post-COVID years. Just to give you a number, in FY19, FY18, FY20, household net financial assets were close to 80% or so of GDP, 80% of GDP. in FY24 and June 24 quarter, that is first quarter of FY25, it was as high as 115% of GDP.
So this would include bank deposits plus stock holdings.
Plus stock holdings,
As assets.
plus insurance,
Yeah.
AUM, plus EPFO AUM, everything of which has been contributed by the household sector, right? This is one part. Net financial assets have gone up. But then we did a very simple analysis of what is its effect on household spending in terms of consumption and investment spending of households. And we found in India, it has not happened. Despite the fact that in the last 4 years, my net financial assets have increased by more than 50%, which is one of the highest across the world for all the countries we included for which such data is available. The growth in consumption that we have seen in the last 4 years and the growth in household investments, I mean, total household spending has actually been weaker than what it was in the pre-COVID years. And India is a unique country. In all other countries for which such data is available, consumption growth was higher or household spending growth was higher in the post-pandemic period vis-a-vis the pre-pandemic period.
Could it be that what's happening is that the guys who made the capital gain by selling use that money to deleverage themselves? So in other words, it went to people who were not into the business of using that implicit additional the capital gain income for consumption. They were using it for balance sheet restructuring, one way or the other.
Possible, but I think it is way more tricky than that, because the question is, what is the leverage of those people who have actually made money in the huge money in the capital markets? Again, based on a SEBI paper, we were told that most of the gains, 94% of the people in the lower income group actually make losses. Almost all the gains in the capital markets are made by people who earn more than 1 crore rupees, which means
But they have a very low marginal propensity to consume. So they already consume.
Exactly, which means actually savings should have gone up, which also hasn't happened.
No, that's why I was saying what may have happened is that these guys are over leveraged. I mean, if you're running a moderately successful middle scale company and making oodles of money, and you suddenly make a lot of capital gain, you pay off your loans.
Possible, if they had that kind of leverage. Possible, but
I'm speculating,
know,
I have no idea.
We know that spending growth has not gone up, which means wealth effect definitely is much weaker or negligible.
Okay, you must send me
Shishir,
these SEBI papers. Send me a link. I haven't seen them.
I just have one quick question. In the DSR, right? Essentially, it's a function of the distribution also, right? People who are taking debt, I'm assuming are relatively on the upper side of the distribution compared to how the income distribution is, right? So if our number is higher at 15%, it may not be as high if we had the same type of distribution from the borrower side, if you know what I mean, right? So if people in our country are relatively richer, people are taking loans, then the DSR becomes debt to income in their income, right? In which case it may come down compared to other countries. Is there a, because it's a distribution, right?
I'm not sure if that can be done.
No, I'm just saying this could be. I'm just saying that since our number is very high compared to our debt to income thing, ultimately it's a function of the distribution of the debt and the distribution of the income.
But then ideally, Shishir, if that is the case, let's say more credit-worthy people are borrowing,
yeah,
whose income is higher, which means PDI would actually be much better than what the aggregate shows. If that is the case,
yeah,
then ideally my interest rate or the cost of borrowing should also be much lower because the person is more credit-worthy than otherwise. And we know that if rich people borrow, they do not borrow for consumption purposes. Strictly speaking, nobody would be borrowing ki mere ko travel ke liye bhi karna hai. They would housing,
so
right?
yeah.
But still we see that housing is only 30% of household debt and it has remained constant. In fact, the most striking fact when I was looking at data, housing debt, only mortgage debt, CAGR growth in the entire 2000s decade was 15%. Mortgage debt, CAGR growth in 2010s decade was 15%. And mortgage debt CAGR growth in the last 4 years was roughly 15%. So we have had GDP going up to down, back to up, but mortgage debt growth has roughly been 15%. Whatever has been moving household debt is the non-mortgage debt. And we know it's not the top of the pyramid who will be doing that kind of borrowing.
Thank you. So as
I have a clarification.
please.
Mudra loans,
Hmm.
20 lakh crores.
Hmm.
There's no mention of it, but it is having a huge impact on household finances. And a lot of those numbers are also in here. And in fact, some of the questions that are being discussed here could also be explained if you started to take that into consideration.
Thank you.
Mudra lending has been going down.
But it's been, for 5 years, it's been huge.
But it would be included in the
So
household debt.
let me just, before I open the thing and I just want what things that have struck me. Okay, one, that very clearly net household financial savings have really gone down. After a long period of 50 years, actually, just about, of going up consistently. One. Two, there is much lower corporate investment relative to the peak years. Okay, and so my mind, the question is, were those peak years an aberration? It's quite possible, or whether what is happening now is something to worry about. And part of that is something I had not realized actually, is that corporates are hardly borrowing, net borrowing.
Yeah.
Which is very unusual. In the sense that.
But they're not investing, so.
Yeah, no, what are they investing is from their retained earnings.
Yes.
Yeah.
What are they investing, right? So that's very odd for the corporate sector. So that's something that. Three, of course, this whole issue of exports, in the sense that if the corporates, well, the few boards that I have been on, let me mention this actually, that the only discussion as far as new investment was concerned was to do with the expectation of higher demand for their products. There was no discussion ever on the corporate income tax cut, etc. Okay? But that's just from the very few, right? But it's consistent with the expectation of growth affecting investments. And so the exports issue is that in terms of expectation of higher demand, in some sense, what you're saying, Shishir, is that even a large corporate sector is not focusing as much on exports as they could to expand their demand, so to speak.
Yes.
Okay. And maybe because of their competitiveness problems. Three other smaller points. One, there's a speculation that on the non-housing borrowing, is health and education a big issue, particularly for the lower income people. And that then would clearly lead to issues to do with debt service capacity. Two, you talked about that our interest rates are much higher than the others, that you talk about nominal. Perhaps you can just reflect on this and maybe after the others are and what about the real interest rate difference? That's one. So Raju first, then Surjit.
Can I just add one point
Yeah,
to
please, yeah,
which
absolutely.
elaborates that?
Please.
I mean, the decline, which all of them have
Yes.
mentioned, and I also mentioned on the net savings of households, that's very marked. The interesting thing is it comes along with an environment where we appear to have given up any commitment to reduce the fiscal deficit. So, I mean, typically, if the net savings is going down and we're not going to reduce the fiscal deficit, you will be creating
So
all kinds of crowding out
so in
problems
fact,
there.
the issue of corporates not borrowing is related to this, that if you net household financial savings, they're the only net savers, all goes into the fiscal deficit. Right? There's nothing there for purely arithmetically for corporate.
Yeah, because I mean, you're down to 5.7% and the combined deficit of center and state is closer to 7. But more importantly, see, in the past, we've actually said that we're going to reduce the fiscal deficit. Today, what we're saying is we're going to gently bring down the debt to GDP ratio. That is consistent with maintaining a reasonably robust fiscal deficit. So I think you need to look ahead. What does that imply?
Raju.
So
Then
Rakesh,
I'll
when I
ask,
picked up this,
Seth.
my question was going to be very different, but then the discussion continued, so I'm not focusing on that question at all. I'm coming back to the question which you raised in the beginning, that you're going to take me on why corporates are not investing. No, I think it's quite clear that corporates are not investing is coming out of the data which Nikhil and Shishir have presented, and that's no doubt about it. There are many, many factors. I think exports is something which we should not look at. I mean, we should look at very, very seriously. We should not, underestimate the power of demand, because demand ultimately is not going to come out of only domestic demand. It's going to come out of exports. And there are many factors. But let me concentrate only on the competitiveness issue, because many a time, I mean, it comes down to corporates, where Nikhil said in his doubt that, corporates, it's quite clear that they are the ones who invest because they invest in the R&D and machinery, etc., etc., etc. That's all fine. But I think the factor pricing in India today is extremely distorted as far as the economy is concerned. If you look at each of the inputs which are required for the corporate sector, particularly in manufacturing, whether you look at land, energy, finance, other inputs, even water for that matter, each one of them is today completely distorted. I mean, let's take energy for one. The corporate sector is paying 3 times the cost of the generation of electricity. You can generate today power at 2 rupees 50 paisa from, including from fossil fuels. And solar, now you can generate at almost at 2 rupees. Wind you can generate at 2 rupees 50 paisa. Corporates are paying in excess of 8 rupees, 9 rupees for generation. It's not the distribution, it's a distorted market where corporates are really cross-subsidizing other sectors. So that needs to be corrected. Similar things are happening, whether it be fertilizer subsidies, whether it be any kind of, so the market has to become less distorted is very, 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 very important. These are tough decisions which need to be taken. They are political decisions which have major ramifications. The second part is that the corporate sector is also bearing most of the tax burden. Okay, tax rates, one may contest whether they are high or low. I mean, now you have 15% tax for newer companies, but I think if you look at the MAT provisions, etc., which companies have to get into, it's the tax rates are not that low in India as they are made out to be. They are actually quite on the higher side if you look at the global economy for corporates. Maybe for income tax, for individuals, the slabs are starting at a different, I mean, they're starting at a much lower level, but the ceilings are not maybe as high as in many other countries like Nordic countries and so on. But for corporates, the tax levels are quite high. And I think we need to find some mechanism where we come back to the old system of allowing monies to be plowed back into investment to take advantages of tax. And that, I think, MAT is one of the biggest deterrents which was introduced in the economy, though it was done in 1996. After that, also, we've had very good growth rates, etc. It's not that I can say that that's entirely, but I think we need to revisit a lot of these. So the distortions, land, clearances, ease of doing business. I mean, no matter where we are in terms of the rankings, etc. Believe me, I mean, working in the corporate sector, there is no way that there has been any relaxation in ease of doing business. I mean, the complications today from the regulatory framework have in fact increased multifold. I think these are many, many issues. Competitiveness is a subject which can be discussed ad nauseum. We'll never come to a conclusion because it always boils down to these are very difficult, they are not going to happen, but they have to happen. I mean, unless they happen, there is no way we are going to get competitive. Exchange rate plays a very critical part in this. I mean, lot of our money flows are temporary in nature. They are FII flows, not FDI flows. Our FDI flows are today absolutely insignificant. I mean, they will contribute maybe 0.5% to GDP, or even maybe only 0.3 or 0.4% to GDP if you look at a simple mathematics of savings versus incremental capital output ratio. I'm not an economist, by the way. I've never studied economics in my life. So, but I've just been a practicing interested an economics person, let's put it like that. So I think we need to answer a lot of these difficult questions before we say that, corporate investment. So corporate investment, this is one factor which is competitiveness. The other factors are risk. Today, the volatile situation in the world is exports are also suffering because shipments are disturbed. The entire global supply chain is disturbed. And the supply chain is disturbed because of transportation. So there are many factors today are playing a part. There is war situations which were unheard of. I mean, we were talking about a flat world when Friedman was saying, I mean, the wars are going to be fought on economic issues, not on physical issues, but they are being fought on physical issues today. I mean, they are fought on territorial issues, which is, one could never have imagined this would happen. So I think there are today the risk-taking ability of the corporate sector also is an issue. Then we are getting a distorted economy because it comes out clearly from your own figures when you say that, on one part, household savings, part of it goes into the non-listed companies, etc., etc. So you have financial savings which are 115, which have gone up, but your incomes have come down. I mean, they are growing only at 9.1%. And then you see that your spending is only 5.7 is what you came out with in the last decade. So it shows that the incomes which are coming out of the households, of the financial savings, are not there. I mean, they are with higher income levels, they are high, and at low income levels, they are all negative. So this distortion also is becoming more and more today in the economy. I mean, I'm a person who's fortunate that
we're all fortunate in this room.
Yeah, so we are all fortunate in this room. But I think we need to look at this. I mean, I think
so this is just the point with the perfect time to ask Mr. Seth, Secretary Economic Affairs. So I was secretary 20 years before him, and he was 30 years before him in Economic Affairs.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohan. I'm not attempting any response to any of the queries. I don't have any solution. But two thoughts to share. First of all, very excellent insight, both given by Mr. Nikhil and Mr. Shishir, and an excellent overview and a deeper insight given by a synthesis by Dr. Ahluwalia, Mr. Ahluwalia. First, on Mr. Nikhil's point, issue is not that do we have enough savings if our corporate investments were to go up. There's a clear issue. Corporates are not investing. We have just heard. It is not easy to invest in real economy. We still have a long way to go. There are too many frictions. When it comes to the factor markets, we have just heard these are distorted and cost is being borne on where it should not be borne. So there is a big issue, but there's a separate chapter to be done. The second point, where Mr. Ahluwalia mentioned it, that when two people are buying and selling, what is happening on the capital gains? If A gives 100 rupees to B, B doesn't get 100 because something goes capital gains to the government. So to that extent, savings will get distorted in the household, but to that extent, government savings will come down because government has got the corporate or the capital gains tax there. So overall, economy-wide, it is a savings neutral, whether it is in deposits or in the markets. That's a point which I will make on that particular point. Sir, on the 2 points, that is it by design that public sector is being asked to scale down? That's not the attempt. Attempt is here to the organizations, the CPSCs or the government parastatals, which are borrowing with no income of their own or no way of having surplus to service those debt, are being asked, don't borrow, your cost of borrowing is at least 1 percentage point higher. Rather, government will borrow and make it available. The case in point is NHAI. Significant borrowings, but capital grants being given or capital expenditure being given by Government of India was being used to repay that debt, a significant portion. Similar portion, railways have income of their own, but no surplus. IRFC and other organizations borrowing and then funding the capex, they're saying hold back. Government will rather provide. This is happening not just in Government of India, but even in the state government. Number of state governments have gone to that extent of asking their parastatals to borrow in a national account that will get shown in the corporates, not in the government account. So that is getting unraveled. There have been 1 or 2 sectors. For example, whereas petroleum sector, government petroleum sector is not investing as much as they were doing it earlier. So that is a broad number. I would like to share it with you. In terms of have we given up on fiscal consolidation? Not at all. The question is, post-COVID, should it have been a drop, a steep drop, or should have been a gradual drop? So that is what is being followed by the government. That is for people to judge whether the consolidation should have been faster. There is a contrary view also that perhaps we are consolidating it too fast. But if it was a more sharp consolidation, perhaps the growth rate seen in 21, 22, 22, 23 would not have been where they are. Where it has impacted is the quality of expenditure on the revenue account. The state government revenue accounts is not getting reflected here. The states which were surplus investing into capex have gone into revenue deficit. High income states have gone into a revenue deficit. That is a worrisome aspect, that the quality of expenditure, government as a whole, is on a revenue account is certainly not in a path where we should be. And there are several other issues, but it can't be covered in about 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Before I ask Surjit, one connected question has come from the virtual side, from Prachi Mishra, the specific question. On the public sector enterprises that you gave the data, does that include state public sector enterprises?
No.
That does not. So that's Prachi, I hope you're there. So that answers that. Surjit. You need a microphone.
Yeah. I want to end with on taxation, so it's great, which is the point that was just brought up. Two or three quick points. First, the macro. I'm reminded of the permanent income hypothesis, which is what we study. So to what extent is the increase in consumption now part of the Indian economy and the Indian population, etc., adjusting to a higher income level than they expected before? So that's the macro picture first. Second, the big story on investment, etc., and on growth is we're not in New Delhi anymore. This is a global world. You look at any country in the world outside of the US, they are slowing down, investments are down, consumption is down, growth is down. So the only economy that is growing faster than before is the US. So that has to be part of the investment that the private guys make over here. Global uncertainty, etc., that is happening. So that's the second. Third, very little mention of monetary policy in India and the exceptionally high interest rates that we are facing today. And indeed, if you look at the real interest rates today, almost identical to what happened in 2018 and 2019, and the growth deceleration that followed that very high level of real interest rates. Last point on the taxes. The tax to GDP ratio collection, and this was a seminar presented over here, is exceptionally high. It's not high, it's exceptionally high. And it is higher than most countries in the world, and certainly all our competitor countries, East Asia, etc., by a margin of 4 to 5 percentage points of GDP. I'm talking about all taxes, private, personal, corporate, GST, whether they are good taxes, bad taxes, they should be done, not should be done, I don't know. But the macro, the international macro is we are taxing the hell out of the economy, and I'm not at all surprised by the slowdown. You combine real tax rates to GDP, you combine real interest rates, what's the puzzle? None. The real puzzle is that why is the Indian economy growing at the rate it is, given these taxes and given these high interest rates? That's the wonder that is India.
Thank you. Rahul?
Thank you, Shishir and Nikhil. Nikhil, a question for you. If I'm a company, and if I look at the economy where in 20 years, the trend has been service sector growth disproportionately, industry relatively flat, agriculture down, US is higher services, but that's been stable relatively. So if I'm just moving people and ideas and stuff, electrons around, then wouldn't you think the trend should be, I don't need as much investment as traditional? And the flip side of that is education. It's not counted as an investment, but that is where a lot of companies are actually just hiring the best and or supposedly the best and the brightest. And that's their competitive advantage, which doesn't scale as well, given the really poor quality of different layers of our educational system. Any thoughts to that?
No, you're absolutely right, Rahul. And this is connected with what Dr. Bhalla just mentioned, that this slowdown in investments, a part of it is definitely structural, because the entire driver of world economic growth is moving away from the manufacturing sector, which is much more investment intensive than the services sector. And now services sector is the primary driver for the growth everywhere in the world. So yes, I did not mention it. I had only 20 minutes, so I could not share.
Actually, you had 30.
Okay, I had 30 minutes, but still it was not enough for me. But even I don't believe that we need to go back to 38, 39% kind of I don't think we should be even targeting that. This, one of the structural reasons is, as you have mentioned, there are other factors as well. But yes, I am with you on this. The way when we talk about gross capital formation, it does not include any soft infrastructure creation or services, education or health. It only looks at physical infrastructure. Yeah. So yes, I agree.
And that's a metrics issue.
Yeah. So a couple more questions from the virtual viewers. One is from Anurag Bavaria. Is there a difference in the degree of multiplier effect of capex by central governments and state governments? 2, can bottom-up fiscal policy capex be more effective in propelling GDP growth of India? I'm not quite sure what that means, but there it is.
Okay, I'm not sure. But
First one, is there a difference in the degree of multiplier effect of capex by the central government and state governments?
Okay, so I haven't done any such analysis, but just if I look at the areas where the center and states do capex are very different. Center's capex area primarily are roads, railways, and defense. Now, states do not invest in railways and defense. Yes, they do invest in road sector, but irrigation projects or education sector, agriculture sector, they are primarily the states sector where they invest. So I think the areas are very different. I have not done any analysis whose capex has a higher multiplier effect, but I don't know if you're aware of any such research that has been done. I have not done, but I know that the areas are very different for us.
So Shishir, that's work for you in the next 1 year.
Yeah. Since I'm not disciplined, I think I can stray into this.
Second question.
This is, can bottom-up fiscal policy capex be more effective in propelling GDP growth in India? Not quite sure
what is bottom-up.
Yeah,
I have no
exactly.
idea. So we'll do.
I've never heard of it.
Gemini, you wanted?
Yeah, can I have microphone?
Yeah.
Thank you. This is, I think, very, very educational for me, particularly on the slides, both from you, Nikhil, as well as from Shishir, and the comments by Montek and Rakesh. I'm not going to get into the investment levels and so on. I'm looking at it more from the perspective of the financial sector, specifically banks, and within the banking sector, private banks. I'm aware that for some time now, and the RBI has noted it, and those of you who are interested can go and look it up on the RBI's website, on what is known as cash flow based lending. It is not based on net worth. It is not based on the assets of the borrower, but they're only looking at the inflow of cash. And that is for a range of businesses, starting from, say, a hairdressing salon to some kind of a medium scale enterprise. Now, what does that mean when you have, I'm not suggesting that the public sector banks are slouches or slow. They are, as we all know, subject, particularly in the past, to pressures from all kinds of quarters, including the government. But the private sector, it is envisaging, private sector banks, I'm saying, envisaging that savings are not going to go up, and investment from large corporates is not going to go up. So they are targeting almost individuals or small businesses who have healthy cash flows. How does all this add up in your view? It's not directly related to the presentations today, but they are ultimately going to affect investment both at the central and state government level if there is any kind of a hiccup, small or big, with regard to our private sector banks.
Before you answer, Janaka, when you also, then you can answer both.
So thank you both of you for that very nice presentation. Nikhil, first one clarification, then of course I have one observation. The clarification is that the Reserve Bank had come out with the debt to service ratio of the household sector. And that ratio was much lower than the ratio what you have shown. That was something like 6.3%. So,
Yes.
so that was in financial stability report. You would like to have looked at that. Or I would like to understand why there is so much difference between that debt to service ratio and your DSR. That's number one. Number two, you raised a very pertinent question. If the capex has to pick up by the corporate sector, how the financing has to be done. Let me give you some insight into this capex, what happened in 2003 to 8. So when the corporate sector capex picked up in 2003 to 8, corporate sector borrowed almost 4 percentage point more than their savings. So during the same time, the government fiscal deficit, there was turnaround something like 4 percentage point of GDP. So I'm not sure whether it's going to happen this time or not, but it happened last time. But let me give you another data which suggests that it might happen. So at present, a general government debt to GDP ratio is 82.7%. So if you take the R minus G differential and you extrapolate it 2007 years had 2030 or 2029, the debt to GDP ratio is only going to rise. It's going to rise from 82.7% to something like 85.
84, 85, yes.
So in order to reduce the debt to GDP ratio to the mandated level of something like 60%, general government to 60%, then there has to be a turnaround in primary balance. Like you have primary deficit now, and that it has to turn into a primary surplus. That ratio is something like 4.5 percentage point of GDP. So my feeling is that if corporate sector capex picks up, and if you see to the 3-8 period, the tax to GDP ratio had also improved because the tax buoyancy was very high. So my feeling is, I don't expect much from the household sector now because financial liabilities of the household sector for 2023-24. They have increased. My feeling is they have increased at a higher rate. I made some assessment, though not borrowing from NBFC, but based on data on borrowing from the commercial banks. That household debt in 2023-4 is expected to have grown at a higher rate than even the last year. So my feeling is financial liabilities must have increased at a higher rate even in 2023 and 24 than 22-23. So unless you reduce the physical savings or you step up your savings rate, I don't think that's going to happen. So if the financing has to come, I think it has to come only from the government sector. They have to reduce their savings, and that's where the key
reduce the deficit rather than increase. Yeah. So last question from the back, and then give the answer.
Yeah, thanks very much. Rajan Govil, Macroeconomic Advisor at the IMF South Asia Technical Systems and Training Center. A quick question for excellent presentations, both Nikhil and Shishir. And a question for both Mr. Nikhil Gupta and for Mr. Adish Seth, given the comments he made. The question, sir, is that, when you talk about the public sector, the central government, let's say the general government, plus the CPSEs, has the capital expenditure actually increased or it's the same? Given that, you've taken out the loans that the central government is making to the CPSEs, right? And so that shows up as a smaller amount of money being spent or expenditures of the CPSEs, because you've already taken out those loans from the central government's budget. If you actually include those back, then maybe the overall general government plus CPSE capital expenditure remains about the same. Do you get the question I'm asking?
I think.
You don't. Okay. So the question is, Mr. Seth, is this clear?
Ajay, do you want to respond to that at all?
If we look at the overall number, yes, there has been a shift of what some of the CPSEs were borrowing, and that has been taken to the government account. To that extent, if we look at the gross number, that have not gone up. But has there been no increase? No, that has not been the case. But has the total capex by Government of India and CPSEs has gone up by 3 times? No, that has not gone up by 3 times. But has it remained flat? It has not remained flat. Where it has gone down is at the state government level. The state government level were spending a lot more on capex. Their capex has come down. So overall, what the graph by Mr. Nikhil was showing is about 6% is the capex which has remained. That's the number we're nice to look for.
Yeah, okay, just very quickly, a clarification. Okay, I'll do it bilaterally.
Yeah,
Thanks.
okay. Nikhil?
Yes.
So, sorry, before you, there's one more virtual question, pretty specific. This is from Vandana Vasudevan. Nikhil, thanks for an insightful presentation. I have a question for you. If you see some of the reports that attempt to measure India's consuming class, like Goldman Sachs, Price 360, etc., they unanimous that India's consuming class is very small, not more than 100 million households, which means about 400 million people. Only 8% own cars, only 16% have TVs plus fridge plus washing machine. Would you agree that consumption may be increasing, but the people who are consuming are not more than 30% population?
Okay.
Now, all yours.
Okay. Shishir, you want to take that cash flow question?
Yeah, I can.
So you can take, then I'll answer Janakrat's question and this question. So you can.
Okay, so Dr. Bhagwati, I think it's an interesting question. And the reason I'm basing my answer is that I was part of the big report that McKinsey did for Ministry of Electronics in 2019, which was on the impact of digital on some of these interventions, right? So this cash flow based lending, one of the primary things is to have their cash flow transactions with the bank, which is possible with digital intervention, right? Now, we had estimated in that report that with this unlock, if this can be made possible, actually is one of the biggest unlocks for growth, because right now MSMEs are constrained for capital. So going by that logic, I think if it is happening and happens on a scale, then you might see household sector, which is basically households plus smaller entities, their share investment might go up.
With concomitant effects later on in savings, etc., etc.
Yeah,
because you lend to SMEs, they do well, then they'll have savings.
Yeah,
but somewhere it should show up. But I'm saying right now, you did this study in 2019.
2019, but since that time the idea was what is the scale of the gap, and hence if the gap is met, then what could be the overall benefit. And in that scheme of things, this was the biggest economic value item.
We have to wait then.
Yeah, of course.
Nikhil. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, please.
Like move away from collateral-based lending into cash flow lending. I think it has a multiplier effect beyond, I don't know, the economics of it can be done by the numbers, but it's a very, very critical ask from industry.
So there's a question there which I'll take and then no more. And then we can answer that.
Yes. I would like to take it.
First of all, thank you for the insightful presentation. I'm Pallav Srivastava. I'm currently doing Mukherjee Fellowship, currently working at the office of Honorable Minister Ashwini Vaishnavji. I wanted to ask a question on consumption. Basically, if you see the growth years of China, in that their consumption was it varied from 35% to 40%. Right now, consumption of our economy, which drives our economy, is around 55% to 60% of GDP. Of course, there were political economy reasons for to basically lend to the corporate sector in China. How we discussed investment and saving conundrum. How do you see the consumption and investment conundrum in India? Basically, a lot of economists also say that consumption was kept low in China so that investment could be fueled. So is that even possible in India to basically, what is the conundrum between consumption and investment, and how do you see that basically? Thank you.
So Nikhil, so you have to answer all these questions now.
Okay, Dr. Raj, the clarification you asked, yes, FSR of June 24, they mentioned that DSR is only 6%. Okay, if you look at the details, they mentioned that effective interest rate is close to 10%, but the average maturity of household debt is as high as 13 years, according to RBI. I don't understand how is that possible, because based on the RBI's data, we know total housing or mortgage debt is roughly about 24-25 lakh crore. 30 lakh crore, not more than that, including HFCs. 30 lakh crore out of total household debt of 102 lakh crore, which gives you 30%. Now we know mortgage debt is the has the longest tenure, let's say 10 to 15 years. And then we know there are business loans, there are agricultural loans, and there are consumption-based loans. Now, if RBI is estimating 13 years to be the average maturity, they are saying that even the average maturity of non-housing loans is also more than 10 years. I don't understand it. We know crop loans are for less than 1 year. Most of the businesses loans are for less than 1 year, which means 1/3 of the entire household debt is less than 1 year. And within non-mortgage debt, vehicle is only 1/3. The remaining, I guess it would also be 1 to 2 years. So that's why I said the bigger difference why they got 6% and I am getting 12% is the average maturity, which they are getting at 6 years. They are getting at 13 years. I am getting at 6 years. Okay. 2003, yes, you're right. It happened, but I give you one data point for 2003. Right? When my total investments increased from 24% to 39%, my current account balance in 2003 was a surplus of 2.3% of GDP. Right? Post-independence, the only 3 years when India had surplus, 3 consecutive years was 1, 2, 3. My current account balance moved from plus 2.3 in 2003 to minus 2.3% of GDP in 2008. Which means when my investments increased by as much as 15 percentage points or so, more than almost a third of that, which means current account balance moved from plus 2.3 to minus 2.3. So it moved by 4.5 percentage points of GDP. Huge movement. We were able to do that because I had a surplus on my current account before 2004. So yes, government this savings went down, household savings went up, but total investments went up, and almost a third of that was accounted for by external savings.
What I'm saying, so I think you will take this bilateral.
Okay. And yes, you're right. Primary deficit, if government debt to GDP ratio has to go down, then actually fiscal consolidation has to be much more faster. Because we have also done these calculations and we see if we continue to be on the same path, even in late 2040s, we will not be able to reach 60% of GDP, which was the target pre-COVID. So yes, this was the only questions you asked. Yeah? On India versus China, I mean, I don't think we should be comparing India with China or with the US as well. China followed a very different model. And please understand, we are talking about ratios. Consumption is percent of GDP or investment is percent of GDP. If one is going up, the other has to come down because eventually there has to be 100%. So China wholeheartedly supported the investment-driven model. And they incentivize the producing segment of the society. And so whatever resources you have in economy, either you can support the consuming sector or the producing sector, right? So when they supported the producers, it's clear for any economy in the world, the rest of the economy is a much bigger area than the domestic economy, right? So when they were incentivizing the producing sector, they either, so if I'm asking you to produce, you will either be able to sell it domestically or you will be able to sell it outside my domestic economy, right? They incentivize that. When they incentivize the producers, they had to transfer the resources to the producing segment, and they decided to kind of suppress the household sector to incentivize the producer sector. Correct me if I'm wrong. So this is what my reading is. And of course you can.
No, absolutely. Actually, I think.
So,
this business of-
have you finished?
No. Okay.
So one more, then I think one each of you.
Okay.
Right. So when they were supporting the producer segment, they were suppressing the household sector, domestic economy. Of course, consumption had to come down, right? But if you're producing, you have to sell your goods to the rest of the world. And that's how it led to an investment and export driven economy. We have to decide whether we want to follow that model or not. Because now we know, yes, 30 years, it was an amazing, miraculous model. Now we know that it also has its limit. And we also need to understand one last sentence. We also need to understand what development stage are we at right now. What was possible in 1970s, 80s, and 90s may be totally impossible in today's world. So a lot of things need to be considered, but that is where I am.
Montek?
My only point, I think this is a very important issue. I mean, he's actually said it all, but I'll say it a little more brutally. But actually, what the Chinese were able to do was essentially to repress the real wage. And they're only able to do that because they're not a democracy. I mean, look, their per capita income is whatever, 12,900. Ours is 2,700. Then I've talked to people, the real wage people get in the formal sector in China is not much higher than our chaps are getting. So it's quite possible our chaps are getting too much. There's no question that they're getting too little. You know, and that's why they had 50% of the GDP was being invested. So I mean, that is really, it's not a model, and it's.
Shishir?
No,
Okay.
I think,
So I'll just conclude first of all by saying how fascinating this discussion has been. And I think the questions both among ourselves as well as the audience say there's lots more work and can be done. And it's a crucial question. Basically, are we essentially in a 6% growth mode, or is there a chance of going to 8% plus? I'll just have two or three other brief comments. One, actually, this China issue, I have a different view, by the way. And it is connected to Surjit's permanent income issue. So in the case of China, people say they suppressed consumption. This is totally wrong. Okay. If your income, if your GDP is growing at 10% a year, consumption is growing at 7% a year, real, it's huge. People starting from very low incomes are seeing continuing 7-8% growth in their consumption and incomes, etc. So they're consuming like mad. You look at the numbers of any kind of consumer goods in China, they went up like mad all through. So it's just arithmetic in the sense, if the income growth is 10%, your consumption was 7-8%, whatever it was, your savings growth will continue going up and you'll keep investing more. So I don't agree at all that the Chinese have been suppressing consumption. And you can see that whether it is cars, whether it is refrigerators, whether it is housing, anything you care to take. Their numbers have been exploding right from the 1980s and 1990s. So I just completely disagree with most of the world, which says that they have been suppressing consumption. Yeah, one second. Yeah. Yeah.
Consumption growth in China. And you can see that from the poverty numbers, that they reached less than 2% poverty just 5 or 6 years before we did. That's it. So they have, their consumption growth has been much lower and their investment growth much higher.
Yeah, no, that is correct. That's what
So-
I'm saying. Look, that is absolutely correct. The consumption growth has been low, investment growth, but it's still 7-8% a year, real, for 10 to 30 years. That's a huge consumption growth. And you look at
consumption growth same as China.
He has to take a flight.
That's the point I'm making, is our consumption growth has been the same as China.
Not 7-8% a year for the last 30-40 years.
Another session on this.
Okay,
Quite
yeah.
interesting.
So just one response to you, Raju, on corporate investment, all the difficulties which you said were real. This will have another bilateral, but the question I'm raising is, how come, was it the case that doing business was easier 20 years ago? How come the corporate investment as GDP has come down as much as it has, as Shishir had documented? Because I presume, I don't know that, either things have become much worse. So all those points you're making are correct, everything that you said. But we are comparing like to like over the
period of time, not with other countries. So one last comment. You will notice the country did well between 2002 and 8. During that time, I was Deputy Governor of Reserve Bank and Secretary of Economic Affairs. Then things went down. Then things went up again 2012 to 15 when I was representing the country in the IMF. And then again, things went down. They started going up again when I became a member of the Economic Advisory Council, the PM. So all this can be explained by one word.
You are the part-time member still.
हाँ
Yeah.
तो अच्छा हो रहा है अभी ये तो. Thank you so much everyone for staying.